Hi guys, so I'm here to talk about scaling Lisant. So some of you may know Julio, the other half of Lisant. So essentially Lisant is, why can't I move things? Fail, oh there we go. So Lisant, it's a feed reader, but it's a feed reader that also does full content bookmarking, and we can do full text search across all of that. So you can subscribe to feeds, you can bookmark any page on the web, even through paywalls, and all of that gets full text searchable. That was our little idea that we ran with, and we started about 3.5 months ago. The original plan was that we'd try and do it in a weekend. 3.5 months later, and we're still going, and we only just started trying to charge people. We'll see how that goes. So I'll give you a quick demo and show you what the app is all about. The page that I opened earlier is no longer there. This could be an issue. Let's just see what happens. Does anyone know what happened to the other page I opened earlier? I minimized it so that it would be ready. Oh, there it is. I can see. Fantastic. So, when you land in Lisant, it looks like this. So, it's a rather nice looking feed reader. Unfortunately, I can't claim credit for the front end, as that was mostly Julio. Well, it was all Julio, what am I talking about? I'm the back end guy, and this talks about scaling things, but I'll give you a quick demo. So, the left hand side I have bookmarks, and okay, my internet connection does not seem to be working on this laptop, so I will breeze past this little part of the presentation. Oh, there we go. It is working. So that's the sort of thing I'm into, implementing quantum pseudo-telepathy. It's fantastic, and that's a really bad example. So I'll pick another example of a bookmark, first of all. Right, so that was a successful demo, so we'll skip past that. So some statistics. We've been going 3.5 months. We went into we were private beta about 2 months ago. And during private beta, we had about 100 users, and then we went into open beta and collected some more users. And 2 days ago, we implemented billing, so you can actually go on the site and pay for a subscription now. So we're still in the early days. We only have 300 users. But there's 10,830 feeds in the system as of this morning, and 13,500 subscriptions. Nearly 1 million different articles have been indexed, and 751 full content bookmarks have been created. And overall, across all of our users, 36,000 articles have been read. So one of the biggest things is with writing a feed reader is that you don't actually need many users before you suddenly start hitting scaling problems. How do you poll 10,830 RSS feeds and keep fresh and up to date? So that's what this talk is about. So I call it an F10K problem. So 10,000 feeds, it's early days, but we're paying for this out of our own pocket. There's no investment, we have day jobs. So actually having an economic incentive to not spend huge amounts of money on hosting is important to be able to deal with this without spending thousands of dollars a month out of our own pocket. So how do we scale to 10,000 feeds? So feed polling is about balancing two conflicting priorities. There's a desire for all feeds in the system to be fresh at all times for all of our users. The problem with that is if you go for that goal, your hosting costs tend towards the infinite. So the amount of bandwidth you consume checking and polling for updates, and the amount of CPU you burn parsing and processing all those feeds just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So how can you optimize those two requirements? So there are some optimization opportunities in this. Feeds that are frequently updated, we obviously want to poll more often. There's no point in polling a feed that's only updated once every week, polling that every 5 minutes or 10 minutes or whatever. That would be a waste of time. And the other side of the coin is that we can deprioritize feeds that have a low number of subscribers. If we have a feed in the system with only 1 subscriber, the importance of that feed, making sure it's up to date, would be less important than polling a feed that has 100 subscribers. So For the first 6 weeks or maybe even the first 2 months of Lisant, we did a really dumb feed polling thing. We just downloaded everything in the system every 2 hours. And because that was the first thing we could do. Like the first thing we wanted to do was the MVP of getting the site there, people could see it and use it. Users don't care about what our algorithms are like at the back end. That's a hosting cost thing. But eventually that was starting to become a pain. We were pegging the server every 2 hours. And it's like, Julia, it's time to get serious. We need to download some feeds properly. So we decided let's come up with some metric of how important a feed is. So we decided to give a feed a score. And the most basic thing we could think of was that the score of a feed is the number of recent articles in the feed multiplied by the number of subscribers to that feed. And arbitrarily, we picked number of recent articles as being the number of articles in the last 3 months, in the last 90 days. An arbitrary figure, but it was a starting point. So I made a histogram. So we take 10,000 odd feeds, we check, we score them all, and then I created a histogram of a distribution of the scores. And it's a log scale as well. So this side represents, the further to the right you go, the score is increasing, and the further up you go is the number of feeds that have that score. So I think the bin size is about 100 points. I can't remember when I made this histogram. So what we end up with, you can tell a market demographic. That line represents Hacker News, I think. So Hacker News is hugely important. It's a lot of our friends that are on the service, that's what they subscribe to. That's what we want to keep up to date. Hacker News has an update frequency of minutes. So we want to keep making sure we poll that. So we have a basis here of starting to make decisions and doing interesting things rather than just grabbing everything and being dumb. The opposite end of this graph, just interestingly enough, is I think some of these feeds up here, they get updated about every 18 months. That's how often they actually write new blog posts. And a lot of people seem to subscribe to them. Who knows why? So once I'd calculated all the scores, this is a quick view into our database. So we have a feeds table, and I've created an update priority on a feed, and that's just the number. That is the number of subscribers multiplied by the number of articles that have been published to the feed in the last 90 days. That results in a score. That's the update priority, which is taken from the bin of the histogram. So all of the bins of the histogram are labeled, so the score is converted into a bin. And that's what the update priority is. It turns out that everything with a priority higher than 2 in our arbitrary made-up fudge function updates less than once every 24 hours. And only 46 feeds out of 10,000 have more than one article in them per day. Who would have thought? So it was kind of like a nice dividing line for deciding how often to poll things. So for high priority feeds, so let me just give a bit of a backtrack onto how our stack hangs together. So we're a Ruby shop at the back end. It's Rails. And we're on Heroku, and we use Sidekick for managing background jobs. So we fire jobs at Sidekick for downloading feeds. So the way we tackle the high priority feeds is that every 5 minutes, we fire off a job that says, load all of the high priority feeds. There's only 46. So we can check those ones every 5 minutes. It was an easy decision, and it's cheap. We don't get billed for bandwidth on Heroku until we go past something like 2 terabytes a month. So, so it's like, we'll just do the easy thing, and at some point in the future when it becomes economically important, we'll do something smarter. But for now, it's like anything that updates more than once a day, we'll check it every 5 minutes. For everything else, we decided, okay, so we said we'll draw a line in the sand for everything else that updates more than once per day. And when I say more than once per day, most of the feeds in that long tail are monthly or yearly updates. So we don't want to be checking those every 5 minutes. But we drew a line in the sand and just said, okay, so what would be the cost if we polled at least all of those feeds once per day? It turned out it was fairly minimal. Checking them all basically means checking one feed every 10 seconds when you do the math. Problem that you get then is, how do you download those 10,000 feeds without killing your database by having like a job every 24 hours? The dumb way would be every 24 hours, you fire a job that says fetch everything, and you peg your entire back-end queuing system for hours and hours and hours while it processes them all. So the key is spreading out across the day. So we spread the load. The way we do this is we fire up a job every 15 minutes, and every 15 minutes that downloads that many feeds, which is 10,000 over how many 15-minute intervals there are in a day, and that's about 6 feeds a minute, or 1 every 10 seconds. For the curious, we use Clock, which is a Ruby gem for, it's kind of like cron, but Heroku understands it, and you don't need access to cron to run cron jobs on Heroku. It's we can put it in a proc file, and it will be picked up by Heroku, and we can run background jobs on a Heroku dyno. So we can say in a really nice DSL, every 15 minutes, refresh the low priority feeds, every 15-minute interval, and we do some modular arithmetic to work out, based on the ID of the feed in the database, which 15-minute slice it falls upon, and then we just tell Sidekick, go do that, which is really quite straightforward. So there's only 2 configurations for our feeds. There's high priority stuff and everything else, and that's it. So at the moment, it's really simple. Some other bits that might be useful. So the things that, behaviors that we want that just kind of fell out of the scoring system is that feeds without subscribers are never polled because they end up with a score of 0, and therefore they just never get checked, which is what you want. You want to rescore a feed. So every 24 hours, you want to make sure that we get new subscribers, people subscribe to new stuff, it changes the counts on the feed of how many users subscribe to that. You want to change the priorities of the downloads accordingly, and you just want it to work. So every 24 hours at some wee hour of the morning, we fire up a job that says, run a big giant SQL query across all our database and recalculate the update priority for all the feeds. And that happens magically. So just in terms of implementing that, we went through a lot of hell. It seems fairly straightforward and obvious on the surface, but just from an implementation perspective, I don't know how many of you guys in this room are Ruby devs, but Ruby HTTP clients in a multi-threaded environment are an absolute ghetto. There's probably about 20 different gems for doing HTTP client requests in Ruby, and they all fail in horrible ways in a multi-threaded environment. So a lot of them shell out to external processes in order to be able to download things in parallel. That doesn't work on Heroku. Doesn't work in Sidekick either. A lot of them have timeouts that don't work in a multi-threaded environment, so you can't stop. You can't say, I want to download a feed and have that and time out after 20 seconds or 30 seconds or whatever. The timeout never happens, so you end up blocking a thread and you block a worker. So the most reliable one we found was HTTP client, which actually exposed the redirects as well, because one of the other things we need to do is canonicalize the URL for a feed to dedupe the database. When you're dealing with millions of records, you don't want to have hack and news stored under 2 different URLs. You want to have one version of hack and news. So if anybody's got to it via a redirect, you want to have the canonical URL for that. So as we grow, we started off in Ruby. We know Ruby really well. Event-driven I/O, fantastic. Yeah. So we know Ruby really well. It was the most pragmatic choice, and we're trying to get something done in a weekend. 3.5 months later, it's still going, still working on it. At some point, it will become economically viable to switch to Node.js or something of that ilk. Basically, we want more control. You want to be able to throttle things. You don't want to tie up threads. You don't want a thread to be blocked in Ruby on I/O. You want to use as little hardware as we can get away with, so that we can maximize our revenues and we actually finally start earning some money. So the original title of this talk was Hubris and Humility. Before, my talk wasn't as performance-oriented and scaling-oriented originally, but I thought I'd touch on a few things that happened along the way. So our current stack is Ruby 1.9.3 and Rails 3. And the key thing here is that the stuff in the middle isn't as important, but it's Ruby 1.9.3, Rails 3, and we're deployed on Heroku. And when we first started this, we were like, hey, this is our dream thing. Like, you're working on a project with some mates. You can choose whatever bit of stack you want to use, whatever tech takes you fancy. And suddenly all pragmatism goes out the window, and you think, screw this, I can use whatever I want. Let's use the new shiny. So the original stack we used was Rails 2, Ruby 2 and Rails 4 with our own DigitalOcean VPSs. And it was an absolute epic disaster from a number of reasons. So at the time, Rails 4 was still release candidate, right? It was like a month, beta 1, right. Now it seemed fairly stable from reading stuff online, but then you throw something like downloading 10,000 feeds every couple of hours at it, and it gets sad. Go to the next slide. So yeah, there were yaks. One of the biggest problems was there's a bug in Active Record and the PG gem in Rails 4, where in a multi-threaded environment, it will lose track of its prepared, the database driver will lose track of prepared statements and let you know, sometimes by a friendly exception, but more often by a seg fault at a random time during the day or night. So yeah, there were yaks that we didn't want to shave. When you're trying to get something done in a weekend, you just really don't want that. So that was the symptom of that. I've been following bug reports, and this is manifesting itself in various ways. It's being reported on Rails 4, it's being reported against the PG gem, it's being reported in Sidekick. I don't think anyone owns the error yet, and it still exists. This still hasn't been fixed as far as I'm aware. Yeah, so keep calm and shave that yak. The other yak shave was not as big, but it was still fiddly, and you don't want to do it. It's we chose to use Grape because for our JSON API for the back end. So Lisant is a nice HTML5 app, and we implemented the back end like it's a JSON API. At the moment, the front end of our app is the only thing that uses that. But we were like, hey, let's use Grape. It's the new shiny. One of the things, the way it integrates with Rails is that it's mounted into Rails, into the Rails routes. But for whatever reason, Epic Yak Shave trying to get authentication information shared between Rails and the Grape API. Something just wouldn't pass. I can't remember all the details right now. Julia would probably be able to enlighten you on that one. But we couldn't pass authentication information between the two worlds. So it took a long time to fix that. The lesson to be learned is when you're actually trying to get something done in as short amount of time as possible, we both have day jobs, we're trying to make a product on our own time. You don't want to be experimenting with things, you just want to know what works and just do it. So the big takeaways from this were rolling our own deployment solution was time deducted from building stuff with value. So all of the stuff with DigitalOcean, we were rolling our own deployment scripts, tweaking our own Capistrano files, and we could have just said, hey, let's use Heroku from the word go, and it would have just worked. And you know, DevOps stuff is always harder than what you think. It takes a long time, and my favorite law is Hofstadter's law. It always takes longer than you expect, even when you take into account Hofstadter's law. So just use Heroku from the start, or whatever the equivalent is with the platform of your choice. And the other thing I wanted to touch on was burnout. I've done a lot of side projects with people over the years, and I've never had one that I've managed to sustain for as long as this. And I think partly it's because we've had a really good attitude towards burnout and sustainability from the word go. Burnout is basically the worst thing that can possibly happen to a project. If either you or your co-founder decides that they've had enough and walks away, it's dead. So you don't want that to happen. So from the word go, I acknowledge that burnout is basically the worst thing that can happen. And whenever you think it's going to happen, take some time off. You don't have to give notice, don't apologize to anyone. Just do it, be supportive, and make sure you have regular downtime. Like, don't do a solid weekend and then 5 nights after your normal day job during the week. It's not going to work. Make sure you spend some time with your partner. Definitely have to do that, and that's something I need to do more of and get right. Also, probably the biggest thing in terms of productivity and burnout I found, and probably Julia as well, is try not to work when you're tired. The amount of times we'd be like, oh, we're on a roll, and we'd just try and land this other feature at 3 o'clock in the morning on the first few weekends, and the next day you're like, awesome, you go and check it, and it sort of works, then it doesn't, things are broken, you spend another whole day fixing what you thought you did the day before, so it just cancels out your productivity. All that stuff will amplify your burnout. So don't do that. If you're ever going to try one of these things and do it, just acknowledge that it's the worst thing and just don't get burnt out. Thanks for listening. Any questions?